Hello and welcome to This Explainer. Okay, we've got to dive right into this today because we're looking at one of the absolute wildest ironies in human history. We're going to trace the breathtaking story of how a relatively insignificant, kind of blundering city-state rapidly transformed itself into a ridiculously wealthy, radically democratic, and incredibly tyrannical empire. Yep, we're talking about ancient Athens. You know, the classical age we all romanticize today, the philosophy, the architecture, the literal birth of democracy, well, actually kicked off with a diplomatic fumble of epic proportions. It's a story that forces us to really look at how easily democratic ideals can slip into imperial overreach. And honestly, that's a takeaway just as relevant for us today as it was 2,500 years ago.
So, to understand exactly how Athens became this massive empire, we actually have to rewind to 507 BC. At this point in time, Athens was terrified. They'd just barely expelled an invading Spartan army, and they were absolutely desperate for some kind of protective alliance. So, what do? They sent ambassadors to the royal representative of Darius I, king of the mighty Persian Empire, which was by far the largest and richest state in the ancient world. The Athenian envoys arrive in Sardis, they make their passionate plea for help against Sparta, and they are met with total, utter dismissal. The Persian representative literally looked at them and asked, "But who in the world are you and where do you live?" I mean, from the Persian perspective, the Athenians were just so completely insignificant that the king's own representative had never even heard of them.
And right here is where the massive, history-altering blunder happens. To secure this alliance, the Persian governor demanded the usual terms, which were tokens of earth and water. Now, the Athenian ambassadors, in their complete and utter ignorance of Persian diplomatic procedure, naively assumed they were striking a partnership of equals because, that's how Greeks made alliances. Even when they started to realize this was actually a symbol of total unconditional submission to the Persian king, they didn't want to go home empty-handed. So they just blindly accepted it. They accidentally submitted their entire city to Persian rule. When they finally got back to Athens, the assembly was obviously outraged, but, and here's the kicker, they never officially canceled the pact. This completely fumbled diplomacy, this massive, explosive misunderstanding, sets our entire dramatic narrative in motion.
Section 1. Mosquitoes defeat the elephant.
Okay, so how did we get from that massive blunder to an actual empire? Well, a little later, Athens decided to aid a Greek rebellion against Persia, and King Darius was furious. I mean, not only did these insignificant little Greeks attack his kingdom, but they did it after already submitting to him. So he launched these massive punitive invasions, essentially pitting his giant empire, the elephant, against the Greek mosquitoes. The Persians outstripped mainland Greece in literally every category of material resources. A Greek victory seemed completely 100% impossible. And yet, the mosquitoes somehow pulled it off. At the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, the terribly outnumbered Athenian infantry sprinted at a dead run across the plain under a hail of arrows just to crush the Persian flanks. 10 years later, Darius's son, Xerxes, returned with an army so massive it reportedly took 7 days and nights just to cross into Greece. But the brilliant Athenian commander at Themistocles used the geography of Greece to his advantage. He set up this incredibly shrewd naval trap right in the narrow channel of Salamis, where the heavier, clunkier Greek ships could just ram the massive Persian fleet.
So what actually fueled this impossible string of victories? It was the unbelievable, defiant courage of a coalition of 31 united Greek states. Think about the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where a small force led by just 300 Spartans stood their ground against a colossal Persian army. There's this famous story where someone warned the Spartans that the Persian archers were so numerous their arrows would literally darken the sky. And a Spartan hoplite just casually replies, "That's good news, we will get to fight in the shade." I mean, wow. The Greeks were fighting for the fundamental ideal of political freedom. They absolutely refused to become subjects of an absolute monarch. And against all odds, they actually drove the Persians out.
Part 2. Alliance becomes an empire.
Now here's where our story takes a really fascinating and frankly, kind of dark turn. That permanent naval coalition, the one created by the Greeks to clear out the remaining Persian outposts, it soon morphed into a straight-up racket. While Sparta, with its unmatched land army, commanded its own Peloponnesian League, this new naval alliance against Persia, which we now call the Delian League, was led exclusively by Athens. The Athenian leader Aristides was the guy who set the dues. Large states provided entire warships, but the smaller states, they just contributed cash, which was all stored away on the sacred island of Delos. But over time, most of the allies found it way too difficult and expensive to build and crew these specialized 170-man trireme warships, so they just took the easy route and paid cash. Athens, which already had the shipyards and this massive population of guys eager for work, happily took that cash, built the ships themselves, and manned them with Athenian rowers.
So we see a classic bait and switch start to unfold here. Because what happens when an ally decides they no longer want to be in this little club? Well, in 465 BC, the island of Thassos tried to do exactly that. They tried to unilaterally withdraw from the Delian League, and Athens was absolutely not having it. They took the very fleet that was funded by the Allies and used it to lay a protracted, brutal siege on Thassos. When Thassos finally surrendered, Athens forced them to tear down their own defensive walls, surrender their remaining navy, and pay these absolutely extortionate fines. So, just like that, voluntary alliance dues had officially become compulsory imperial tribute enforced directly at the tip of an Athenian spear.
And we really need to pause and look at the sheer scale of this operation. By the mid-5th century BC, the annual tribute flowing directly into Athens from its supposed allies equaled roughly 200 million modern dollars. Just imagine a small town today suddenly receiving hundreds of millions of dollars every single year in totally unchecked tax revenue. For a state of only about 30 to 40,000 adult male citizens, this resulted in an unprecedented, explosive era of general prosperity. Athens had literally built an empire by taxing the very states it was supposed to be protecting.
Section 3. Birth of Radical Democracy. But this imperial racket had a really profound side effect back home. You see, the Athenian fleet was powered by the poorest social class of citizens. These were men called the Thetes. And eventually, realizing their immense value as the actual backbone of Athenian military dominance and wealth, they demanded unprecedented political power. Let's look at the mechanics of how this radical shift actually happened. In 461 BC, a reformer named Ephialtes stripped power away from the elite council of ex-magistrates and handed it directly to the people. They created this wild system of courts manned by up to 6,000 everyday male citizens who were just chosen by lot. There were no judges to instruct them, no lawyers to harangue them. The average citizen was the supreme, unquestioned authority. But then you have a logistical problem, right? How could a poor rower afford to take a whole day off work just to serve on a jury? Well, a brilliant leader named Pericles solved this by introducing state stipends, basically a daily living allowance for public service. This was a total game changer. It completely insulated the courts from wealthy elites trying to bribe their way out of things, and it ensured that average citizens completely controlled state policy.
And the Athenians were fiercely protective of this new equality. They instituted a fascinating safeguard called ostracism. Every single year, they could hold what was essentially a reverse popularity contest. If 6,000 citizens scratched your name onto a piece of broken pottery, which was called an ostraca, you were exiled from Athens for 10 whole years. Now, you kept your property, and it wasn't viewed as a criminal penalty. It was simply a preemptive strike by the majority to ensure that absolutely no single powerful man could ever rise up and become a tyrant over the democracy.
Now, this system demanded absolute trust in the majority, even when the voters were being incredibly petty. There's a really famous kind of funny anecdote about Aristides. Remember him? The very man who set the original Delian League dues? Well, his nickname around town was the Just. On the day of an ostracism vote, an illiterate countryman walked right up to Aristides, completely failing to recognize him, and asked him to scratch a name on his pottery shard for him. Aristides asked, "Sure, which name?" The man replied, "Aristides." Aristides, probably a bit surprised, asked what harm this man had ever done him, and the voter replied, "Oh, nothing. I don't even know him. I'm just sick and tired of hearing everybody refer to him as the Just." So Aristides quietly wrote his own name on the shard. The Athenians totally accepted this kind of eccentricity because they believed down to their core that the collective wisdom of the majority was the ultimate protection for the state.
Part 4. The Golden Age.
So put this all together. You have a radical democracy flush with the overwhelming confidence of having defeated the Persian Empire, combined with a staggering $200 million a year in tribute flowing in from their subjects. This explosion of wealth and civic pride sparked a monumental cultural boom in the decades right before the Peloponnesian War. And this is brilliantly illustrated by the Parthenon. Under Pericles, the Athenians took that imperial tribute money and used it to crown the Acropolis with this billion-dollar architectural marvel. We're talking about a 230-foot-long Doric temple made of 20,000 tons of solid marble, housing a towering 30-foot-tall statue of Athena made of solid gold and ivory. But what's truly mind-blowing about this building is the engineering. To make the temple look perfectly straight to the flawed human eye, they built in these incredibly subtle optical illusions. The columns have a slight bulge in the middle, they lean ever so slightly inward, and the platform itself is actually convex. Furthermore, they added an unprecedented ionic frieze, a continuous sculpted band that boldly depicted normal, everyday Athenian citizens parading right alongside the gods themselves. That was the ultimate statement of confidence. It was proof, in their minds, that the gods favored their empire. And you see this dynamic electric energy bleed into absolutely everything, especially their art. In the past, Greek sculptures mostly imitated the archaic Egyptian style. You know the look, stiff, rigid, looking straight ahead, standing firmly with one foot forward. But in this golden age, utilizing the tensile strength of bronze, artists broke literally all the rules. Sculptors like Myron created absolute masterpieces like the discus thrower. Instead of rigid symmetry, you're looking at a crouched athlete at the absolute peak of his backswing. It captures extreme tension, asymmetrical motion, and flawless anatomical perfection. It perfectly represented this explosive society hanging in a delicate momentary balance.
But as the art itself kind of hints at, beneath all that beautiful balance lies the constant, looming threat of instability. By 431 BC, a 30-year peace treaty masterminded by Pericles had completely shattered. Athens' relentless interference and their growing imperial arrogance had pushed their old rivals, Sparta and its allies, way past the breaking point. The Spartans threatened war, but Pericles refused to compromise, arguing that backing down even an inch would cost Athens its freedom of action. And so we are left with a massive, hanging question. As the brutal reality of the Peloponnesian War looms on the horizon, can this dazzling golden age, a society built on a fumbled Persian diplomacy, heroic underdog victories, and ruthless imperial extortion, possibly survive the coming storm? It's a really striking reminder that the systems we often view as the absolute pinnacle of culture are sometimes balanced on the very fragile edge of overreach. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will leave you to ponder that impending collision.